Steam hissed from the iron monster as it screeched to a halt, wheels grinding against the track like metal teeth. Clara Bennett stepped down onto the cracked wooden platform with a soft grunt, one gloved hand pressed at her lower back, the other clutching a worn carpet bag. Her belly led the way, unmistakably round beneath a faded traveling cloak. She tried not to notice the way the conductor avoided her eyes, or how the porter didn't offer to help with her bag. A gust of prairie wind caught her bonnet and tugged it back. She grabbed at the ribbons, tying them tight beneath her chin as dust coated her boots and skirt. The town of Dust Creek, Wyoming, was smaller than she'd imagined. One main street, 2 saloons, a church steeple slouching to the east, and not much else beyond dry earth and suspicious eyes. She straightened her spine as best she could and stepped forward. She scanned the crowd, half a dozen men leaning on hitching posts, squinting at her like she was a spectacle. Then she saw him, Harold, mid-30s, tall, neatly trimmed mustache, clean vest over a white shirt. He had sent a letter, formal, polite, promising a new life, promising a home. His eyes met hers, and dropped immediately to her stomach. He blinked, jaw twitching. Clara offered him a hopeful, weary smile. He didn't return it. Instead, he turned, neatly like pivoting on command, and walked back the way he came. No words, no confrontation, just a back retreating into the crowd until it was gone. Clara stood there, motionless. A small thud echoed beside her as her bag slipped from her hand and hit the platform. The only sound was the wind and the wheeze of the departing train. Nobody stepped forward. Nobody helped. Her lips parted, but the words caught in her throat. It wasn't the first time she'd been left standing. She bent down slowly, clutching her back with sharp wince, and picked up the bag. The stitch in her side throbbed. She felt 20 years older than her age. Somewhere inside, the baby kicked, as if sensing her tension. Clara walked through town, eyes following her like crows waiting for something to drop. A man outside the saloon laughed too loud. She caught fragments. Mail-order bride, huh? She's got more baggage than just that bag, I reckon. She kept walking. The church had a white cross and peeling paint. The bell looked rusted shut. She climbed the steps and knocked on the door, hope clinging to her like a tattered ribbon. The preacher answered, mid-50s, kind eyes, but they darted down to her belly, and his lips pressed into a thin line. I'm not looking for charity, Clara said softly. Just a place to sit. Maybe warm up. His eyes flicked to the interior behind him. We're low on space. You understand? Clara nodded, her throat tight. I understand. She descended the steps slowly, walking until her legs gave out, and she sank onto the stone foundation of the church. The sky was dimming, the cold setting in with teeth. She hadn't eaten since the appleback on the train. She tried to hum, something gentle for baby, but her voice cracked. I'm sorry, she whispered. I thought maybe this time. She leaned her head back against the wood, closed her eyes. Her mother had told her once, there are 2 kinds of men in the world, Clara, those who want to save you, and those who want to see you crawl. So far, she'd only met the latter. Night crept in. The warmth leached from her bones. She curled tighter, arms wrapped around herself, but her body was failing her. The wind howled, and she shivered. Then she heard it, the crunch of boots on gravel. Slow, steady. She didn't lift her head. Couldn't. Too tired. Probably just another passerby to watch her freeze. But the boot stopped. Don't reckon a lady like you should be lying in the dirt. The voice was low, roughened by wind and whiskey, maybe loss. Not cruel, just honest. She forced her eyes open. The man was tall, built like he knew how to work hard, and didn't much care if it killed him. Tan hat pulled low, coat worn but mended. His face was shadowed, but his eyes, they were steady. No disgust, no pity, just assessment. I'm fine, Clara said, and it was the biggest lie she'd told all day. Doesn't look like it. He held out a hand. Calloused, solid. You need somewhere to get warm. She eyed the hand. He didn't flinch. After a pause, she reached up and let him pull her to her feet. She swayed slightly. He caught her elbow, steadying her with surprising gentleness. You got a name? Clara Bennett. He nodded once. James Coulter. She tried to read his face, but it was like trying to read a rock, weathered and patient, but unmoved. I don't need charity, she said again, because saying it made it feel a little more true. Didn't offer any. He gestured toward the edge of town. I've got a fire and an extra chair. She hesitated. He looked at her then, properly, not at her belly, not at the dust on her dress. Just her. You want to sit here and freeze. That's your call. But you'll be making for two. Clara followed. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way he didn't ask her questions. Maybe it was the way he walked ahead, without once looking back to check if she was coming. Or maybe it was just a simple, steady warmth of someone who didn't flinch. They reached a cabin on the edge of town, small, clean, tucked near the hills. Smoke curled from the chimney. The door creaked as he opened it, the hinges shrieking their protest. Inside it was plain, a fire in the hearth, a table with two chairs, a single cot against the wall. No pictures, no clutter. Sit. He motioned to the chair closest to the fire. I'll warm up stew. Clara sank into the chair, bones aching. The baby kicked again, as if grateful. James ladled thick stew into a bowl and handed it to her with a chunk of cornbread. She took it. Thank you. He grunted, settling into the other chair with a quiet sigh. Silence stretched. You from back east? He asked. She nodded. Georgia. Long ride. Too long. He didn't pry. Didn't ask what she was doing here, or why her eyes looked like they'd been crying since Christmas. Just sipped his stew and watched the fire. After a long minute, she said softly, I was supposed to meet someone. James gave a short nod, like he already knew how that ended. He saw me. Saw this. She touched her stomach and walked away. He didn't say anything. I thought I could hide it. Thought if I moved fast enough, I don't know, fool someone into kindness. Still no judgment, no laughter, just quiet understanding. Well, he said at last, sounds like you found the wrong man. Clara looked over at him. Exhausted. Maybe, she said, or maybe all the right ones are already gone. James tilted his head. Firelight flickered over his face. Don't speak too soon, he said. Clara didn't answer. She just stared into the fire, the warmth reaching slowly into the cold places inside her. For the first time in weeks, she felt like maybe she wasn't about to break in half. Outside, wind howled through the darkness, but in that little cabin, something fragile and unspoken began to take root, quiet as snow, but just as certain. And neither of them noticed a set of eyes watching through the distant shadows. Not yet. The morning light crept in slow, warming the frost that clung to the cabin window panes. Clara blinked awake on the cot, wrapped in a patchwork quilt that smelled faintly of cedar and horses. For a second, she forgot where she was. Then the memory of the train platform, heralds turned back, and the cold night outside the church came rushing in like floodwater. The fire had died down, leaving only embers. Across the room, James stood at the stove, shirt sleeves rolled up, pouring coffee into 2 tin mugs. He noticed her stirring and gave a slight nod. Not warm, not cold, just matter of fact. Didn't figure you for the sleeping kind, he said. Clara sat up slowly, one hand going instinctively to her belly. Didn't figure I'd ever sleep that good again. James placed a mug on the table beside her. Ain't much, but it's hot. She took it, fingers closing around the metal. She hadn't realized how much she missed the smell of real coffee. Steam rose in soft curls, carrying a comfort she couldn't quite explain. Thank you, she said again. James didn't reply. He poured his own cup and leaned against the wall, sipping in silence. The fire crackled. Somewhere outside, a rooster crowed. For a long while, neither of them said anything. Finally, Clara glanced toward the window. You live out here alone? Yup. No family? No more. She hesitated. I'm sorry. James shrugged. Wasn't your fault. The way he said it told her not to press. But it also told her he wasn't angry at the question. Clara set the mug down carefully. I should go. James raised an eyebrow. Go where? She didn't have an answer. She couldn't return to the church. And the train wasn't due again for a week. Not that she had enough coin for a ticket anywhere else. Still, pride straightened her back. I'll find work. Maybe clean at the saloon. James frowned at that. They won't hire you. Because I'm pregnant? Because they're vultures. You go in there, they'll pick you apart. Clara bit her lip. What else am I supposed to do? James didn't answer right away. Then he said, Stay here. For now. Her eyes narrowed. Why? I've got space. You need it. And what do you want in return? James met her stare, without flinching. Nothing. That's not how men work. He didn't smile, but he didn't scowl either. Just took another sip of coffee and said, Maybe you've met the wrong man. The silence that followed was heavy. Not uncomfortable, but full, like the room held more than just words. Clara looked down at her hands. I don't want to be a burden. You're not. She glanced at him. You don't even know me. I know you didn't run when you could have. I know you didn't cry when that coward left you standing on the platform. And I know you're carrying a life that didn't ask for any of this. That's enough. She stared at him. Why are you being kind to me? James shifted his weight, jaw tightening. Because someone should have been kind, my wife, before she died. That shut her up. He stood straight, stepped toward the door, and grabbed his hat. I've got fence to mend. You're welcome to rest here, or walk into town and take your chances. With that, he walked out, the door shutting soft behind him. Clara sat there, holding the warm mug, unsure what she felt. Later that day, she cleaned, not because he asked, but because she needed to do something with her hands. The fireplace was swept, the table scrubbed, dishes washed. She found a little sewing kit tucked in the corner and mended the rip in her hem. When James returned at dusk, boots dusty, shirt damp with sweat, he blinked at the tidy cabin, then said nothing. They ate stew again. This time, Clara helped cook it. As the days passed, a rhythm took root. Mornings were quiet. Afternoons, James worked while Clara read from an old Bible she found in the corner. Sometimes, she walked in the field behind the cabin, talking softly to the child growing inside her. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was peace. And for Clara, peace was more unfamiliar than affection. One afternoon, James returned with a sack of flour and a story about a fox that had outrun his horse. She laughed for the first time since Georgia, a short, rusty sound that startled them both. James didn't comment, just poured coffee. Later that evening, she stood by the fire, her hands resting on her belly. I used to dream of a big white house. Wrap-around porch, flowers along the windows. James didn't look up from the saddle he was repairing. This ain't much of a porch. No, but there's something about the silence out here. It doesn't feel lonely. He gave a low grunt of agreement. Clara turned to him. Were you always like this? Like what? Quiet, steady. James met her gaze. No, I was loud once. Stubborn. Thought the world owed me something. What changed? I buried my wife and son in the same week. After that, quiet made more sense. She looked down. I'm sorry. Me too. They didn't speak again that night, but something had shifted. The fire between them no longer warmed just the room. The next morning, Clara woke to a knock on the door. James answered it, stepping out with his rifle across his shoulder. A man in a dusty vest and a thin mustache stood there, flanked by two others, one holding a town seal. The mayor. Clara stayed back, listening. We've got concerns, Coulter, the mayor said. Woman's not married. Carry in a child. You bringing her into town like this. It's bad for business. James crossed his arms. She's done nothing wrong. She's a scandal. She's a person. You're not married. You give her shelter. Fine. But we won't have her in town. Not until she's respectable. Clara stepped into the doorway then. I'm not hiding. The men looked startled. James didn't move. The mayor cleared his throat. Then you'll have to leave by sundown. James said nothing, but his eyes never left the mayor's face. As the men left, Clara turned to him. They'll drive me out. I've seen it before. James shook his head. No, not this time. What are you going to do? He looked at her, long and hard. They said you have to be respectable. Clara blinked. And James took off his hat, stepped closer, and said, calm and sure, then let's make it so. Her breath caught. Are you asking? I'm saying I buried enough of the past. It's time to build something new. If you'll have me. Clara stared at him, heart thudding like hoofbeats in her chest. Why me? Because you're strong enough to carry life through hell. Because you stayed when you didn't have to. And because I'm not about to let Good get chased off this land again. The fire popped behind them. Clara took a breath. The baby kicked. And for the first time, she said, all right. But outside, past the cabin in the dry wheat fields, a letter was already on its way, headed straight for Dust Creek. And it would bring with it a storm neither of them expected. Rain came in the night. Sparse at first, then steady, tapping against the cabin roof like cautious fingers. Inside, Clara stirred from sleep, wrapped in warmth she hadn't known in months. James had given her the bed weeks ago, taking to a cot in the corner without complaint. The small space smelled of pine logs and saddle oil, and the firelight painted soft amber shadows on the walls. She sat up slowly, her back stiff and belly heavy, and watched James stoke the fire. He was already dressed, boots muddy from his early morning walk to check the fence posts. Morning, he said without turning. Clara rubbed her eyes. You always up this early? Animals don't wait. Neither does weather. She eased herself out of bed, steadying her balance. There's coffee. James gestured toward the pot on the stove. A little strong this time. Might stand up and argue. Clara chuckled, pouring herself a mug. The warmth in her hand felt like peace. They didn't speak for a while, and they didn't need to. A rhythm had found them, unspoken but constant, like two parts of the same song finally playing in tune. James sat at the table and unfolded a piece of paper, smoothing the creases. Clara caught the change in his posture, the way his jaw tensed, how his eyes darkened just slightly. Something was wrong. What is it? She asked. He looked up, reluctant, then handed her the paper. It was a letter, Harold's name at the bottom. Clara scanned it, her heart pounding. The words were stiff and legal sounding. Harold claimed he had rights, said Clara had misrepresented herself by hiding the pregnancy, that if the child was his, which it might be, he added with calculated vagueness. Then he intended to claim custody, that she was an unfit mother, living in sin with a rancher in a backwoods cabin. Clara dropped the letter onto the table, her hands trembling. He can't do this. James didn't blink. He's trying to scare you. He abandoned me, she whispered. Left me standing there like trash. And now he wants to take the baby? He won't. He has money, James. He knows people. What if the sheriff side with him? What if the court does? James stood slowly, walked around the table, and knelt in front of her. He placed his hands gently on her arms. He is not taking that child. I won't let him. She blinked back tears. Why would he even want to? He doesn't care. He never did. Some men don't want a child, James said. They want to control. Clara closed her eyes, drawing a shaky breath. The baby shifted, rolling gently as if sensing her distress. She placed her hand on the curve of her belly, protective and afraid. I've already lost everything once, she said. I can't lose this. You won't, James said quietly. I've got land, a good name. I'll stand up in front of any judge you need me to. But I'm not your wife. You will be, if you still want that. Clara opened her eyes. Are you sure? You don't owe me anything. James looked at her like she'd spoken nonsense. That baby's not mine by blood, but it's mine by choice. And you... He hesitated, words caught like spurs in saddle. You're not just someone I'm helping, he finished. You're someone I'd fight for. Clara leaned into him, her forehead against his. For the first time since she'd left Georgia, she felt safe. That afternoon, while rain turned to mist, they sat on the porch. James carved a toy horse from cedar, while Clara mended a small quilt she'd been stitching from old clothes. the kind of domestic calm that felt too good to last. "What name were you thinking?" James asked after a while. She smiled softly. "For the baby? MM." "I don't know," Clara said. "I used to have a list, back when I thought life would turn out different." He glanced at her. "Still got that list?" "I threw it in the river in Kansas." James raised an eyebrow. "It was very dramatic," she said dryly. He chuckled. "Sounds like it." Clara rested her hand on her belly. "I keep thinking about giving the baby your name." James stopped carving. "You mean James?" "No, I mean Coulter." He blinked. "You sure?" Clara nodded. "When everyone else turned their back, you didn't. You gave me a home when I didn't have one. A name like yours, it'd mean something." He looked down at the toy horse, now shaped but unpolished. "It'd mean something to me, too." She reached over, touching his callous hand. "I want our child to know that family isn't just about blood. It's about who stays." That night, as they sat by the fire, she started to go into labor. It began with pressure, low and sharp, and a pain that radiated through her back. At first, she didn't say anything. She wasn't sure. But when the second wave came, stronger, deeper, she knew. She gasped, clutching the edge of the table. James looked up instantly. "Clara?" She nodded, pale. "It's time." He didn't panic. He moved like a man who prepared for this moment 100 times. Boiling water, laying down clean linens, lighting extra lamps. He helped her to the bed, voice steady, hands gentle. "I'm right here," he said. Clara gritted her teeth as another contraction hit. "I'm not ready. You're stronger than you think." She looked up at him, sweat beading her brow. "What if something goes wrong?" James met her eyes. "Then we face it. Together." The hours stretched, each minute an eternity. The pain tore through her like wildfire, and there were moments when she screamed, begged, cried. But James never left her side. He wiped her brow, held her hand, whispered to her when she thought she'd break. "You're doing it, Clara. You're almost there." She gave one final push. A scream caught at her throat, and then the cabin filled with the cry of a newborn. James caught the child in shaking hands, wrapped it in a flannel blanket, and looked at Clara, eyes wide. "It's a girl," he said. Clara collapsed back, tears falling freely. James placed the tiny bundle in her arms. The baby's skin was red, her fists curled like petals, her cries strong and defiant. Clara kissed the baby's forehead. "Welcome, little one." James sat beside her, not saying anything for a long time, just watching. Clara glanced over at him. "She needs a name." He nodded. "You choose." Clara looked down at the baby, who was now quiet, her eyes closed, nestled against her mother. "Her name is Hope." James's throat moved, but he didn't speak. "It's what got me through the train ride, through the cold nights, through Harold, through everything. She was my hope." James placed a hand over both of theirs, his, hers, and the baby's. "She's ours now," he said, "and she's going to grow up knowing she was never unwanted. Not for 1 second." Clara nodded, eyes glassy. "And she'll grow up with your name." Outside, the mist turned to snow. Quiet, gentle, covering the world in soft white. But far down the road, a man rode hard toward Dust Creek. Legal documents in his saddlebag and vengeance in his heart. And he wasn't coming alone. The wind shifted. James knew it before the dust cloud crested the hill. He knew it from the sudden stillness of the birds, from the way the horses behind the barn began to snort and paw the dirt. He stood on the porch, rifle in hand, body still as stone, and watched the rider come. One man at first, then 2 more behind him. The lead wore a gray coat and rode with the stiff, upright posture of someone who believed the world owed him something. James didn't need to see his face to know who it was. Harold. Clara stood behind the screen door, hope bundled against her chest. The baby slept soundly, unaware of the storm bearing down on them. "Stay inside," James said. "I'm not hiding." He didn't turn. "Not asking you to. Just asking you to trust me." The riders slowed as they approached, their horses stamping nervously. Harold dismounted with theatrical precision, brushing dust from his sleeves as if disgusted to have ridden through it. The other two, one lean and cruel-looking, the other older and fatter, carrying a briefcase, stayed back. "Afternoon, Coulter," Harold said. His voice was smooth, but laced with venom. "Heard you've been playing house with something that don't belong to you." James's jaw tensed. "She's not a thing, and she doesn't belong to anyone." Harold's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Let's not waste time. I'm here for what's mine. You're harboring my property." James stepped forward. "Say that again." "I'll say it slower if you're struggling. She was under contract to marry me. She failed to disclose the conditions she was in. I have affidavits, witnesses, and now I hear there's a child. That makes things complicated." James's hand flexed around the stock of his rifle. "You left her in the dirt, Harold, in front of half the damn town. Because I was deceived. She lied. She survived." Harold's eyes narrowed. "Let's be civil about this. She comes with me. We'll arrange an adoption. Quiet, private. She gets compensated. You keep your barn and your cattle. No one needs to get shot." "She's not leaving." Behind the door, Clara stepped outside. Her hair was pulled back in a braid, face pale but eyes clear. She held Hope tightly, wrapped in blankets James had sewn himself. "You think I'd give you my daughter?" she said. Harold didn't even look at her. He addressed the man with the briefcase. "Present the documents." The older man stepped forward, opened the case, and produced a set of folded papers. "We have a court order, notarized in Cheyenne, valid under territorial law. If the child is proven to be his, Mr. Fallon is within rights to claim custody." Clara stepped down beside James. "You're not touching her." "I'm afraid the law disagrees, ma'am," the man said. "You have until tomorrow to comply." James's voice was calm, but hard enough to cut glass. "If you take one step onto this land with that order, it won't be law you're worried about. It'll be lead." Harold scoffed. "You gonna shoot me, rancher?" James's eyes were ice. "If you try to take that child, yes." The lean man behind Harold shifted, hand drifting toward the pistol on his hip. James saw it, registered it, filed it away. "Come sundown tomorrow," Harold said, "I'll be back with the sheriff, if I have to, or more." He turned, mounted, and rode off without another word. The others followed. James waited until they were gone from sight before lowering the rifle. Inside, Clara rocked the baby with stiff arms. Her hands trembled, but her eyes remained dry. "He'll come back," she whispered. "I know. They could take her." James reached for her hand. "They won't." She looked at him then, with something between trust and terror. "You'd really shoot him?" "I'd shoot anyone who tried to take my daughter." The words sank into her slowly. That night, James oiled the rifle by lamplight. Clara sat in the rocking chair, Hope asleep in her arms. The fire hissed and popped, shadows dancing across the cabin walls like ghosts. "You ever kill a man?" she asked softly. James didn't look up. "Yes." "Was it justice?" "No, but it kept someone else alive." Clara looked down at her baby. "I don't want Hope to grow up in blood." "Neither do I." She stood and walked to him. "Then marry me." He looked up, startled. "Now, if I have your name, they won't be able to take her. And I want it, not because I have to, because I trust you." James rose, slower than usual, like the weight of everything they carried had settled onto his spine. "You sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." He nodded once. "Then let's make it official." The preacher from town came that night, called on James's old debt of friendship. He brought no witnesses but the wind and the moon. They stood outside, beneath the stars, with Hope nestled in a blanket between them. James said no vows, only promises. Clara said no words, only looked at him with eyes that spoke everything. And when the preacher left, they were something more than alone. They were a family. Dawn came cold and sharp. James stood on the porch again, rifle loaded, eyes on the horizon. Clara remained inside with Hope, a revolver tucked into folds of her dress, a quiet readiness in her heartbeat. Hooves thundered. 5 men this time. Harold led them, but the sheriff now rode beside him, a man Clara had seen once in town, thin-lipped and nervous. They dismounted as James stepped forward. "This is it," Harold said, voice smug. "We're doing this proper. She comes with me. The baby, too." The sheriff cleared his throat. "Mr. Coulter, I don't want blood. I really don't. But I've seen the paperwork." "So have I," James said. "And I've seen liars wear law like a cloak before." "She's his wife now," the sheriff said. "That complicates things." "Not really," James replied. "It ends 'em." Harold's hand twitched toward his holster. The lean man stepped forward. "You won't shoot all of us?" James didn't blink. "I won't have to." The door behind him opened. Clara stepped out, one arm around the baby, the other holding the revolver steady. "Try me," she said. The lean man's hand froze. Harold snarled. "You think I'll let some prairie whore ruin my name? You'll regret this, both of you." James raised a rifle. "That's enough." The tension crackled. Wind hissed across the field. Even the horses seemed to hold their breath. Then the sheriff said, "That baby's hers now, and I ain't gonna arrest a mother holding her child." Harold spun toward him. "You useless coward." The sheriff raised his hand. "That's enough out of you, Harold. I ain't getting killed over your pride." Harold looked from the sheriff to James, to Clara, then to the child in her arms. He saw something in her eyes, something solid, unbroken, eternal. He turned, mounted his horse, and rode off without another word. The others followed. James lowered the rifle slowly. Clara exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. It was over. For now. Later, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, they sat together on the porch. Hope cooed softly, grasping James's finger with a grip far too strong for her size. "You all right?" James asked. Clara nodded. "I don't know what tomorrow brings, but I know what today gave me." James looked out the fields, the sky streaked in oranges and pinks. "You gave her a name. You gave me one, too." Clara rested her head on his shoulder. "And now we all have something worth defending." The wind carried the scent of fresh earth and wood smoke. Night would come. So would more storms. But in that moment, nothing else mattered. Because family wasn't something you were given. It was something you fought for and won. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments.